In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Millions died in pursuit of conquering this unknown land. The European powers of the time took part in colonization, and the centuries after witnessed remarkable wars and a new age of influence. These events led to the birth of a new nation on July 4th, 1776, the United States of America. Since, the USA has conquered the world in every aspect possible. From developing the most powerful military in modern history to countless astonishing human accomplishments, the country has earned the name the modern Roman Empire. But can this giant continue its dominance? To understand the story of this fascinating land, we must start from the very beginning. Tense music, upbeat music, long before European colonization, the native peoples of North America had developed complex and sophisticated systems of society and government. Hundreds of thousands warred, made peace, and governed over specific regions, and had done so for thousands of years. By the time the first European explorers began to arrive on the North American continent in the 15th century, the Native Americans had already established themselves and their communities for thousands of years. The North American continent, vast and rich with natural resources, would beckon all who came to know of its shores. And so when a Norse navigator named Leif Erikson learned that there was a land west of Greenland from fellow explorer Bjarni Herjolfsson, he made preparations to set sail. Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course while sailing, had accidentally discovered what would one day be called Newfoundland. And although he did not land, his story gave Erikson the information he needed to successfully sail across the Labrador Sea and make landfall in North America. Erikson and the Norsemen would establish a small settlement in Labrador called Elance Ox Meadow or Meadows Cove. This settlement and numerous small outposts built nearby it would be abandoned over the course of about 20 years. Afterward, it would be nearly another 500 years before Europeans set foot on the shores of North America. Tense music, ominous music, tense music, searching for a more direct and faster route to India. The great European powers of the age sent dozens of expeditions around the globe. In October 1492, the Genovese explorer Christopher Columbus, employed by the King and Queen of Spain, discovered the West Indies and inadvertently opened a new frontier of exploration popularized as the New World by Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci. It was open season for European explorers, traders, and businessmen alike. European powers began claiming sections of this new world as their own with every major exploratory mission. Vespucci, who created and sold maps of his own discoveries in the New World, gained the notable distinction of having the entire hemisphere named for him, America. While much of the early exploration of the New World focused on what would become known as the Caribbean and South America, it did not take long before explorers turned their attention north to the enormous landmass above Columbus's Hispaniola. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Spanish, English, Portuguese, Swedish, Dutch, and French all entered a race to explore and map the entire east coast of North America. In 1497, Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, known as John Cabot by his English employers, discovered the same region of Newfoundland that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had settled nearly 500 years earlier. Cabot's discoveries credited him as the discoverer of the North American continent, as no record of Erikson's expedition or settlement had yet been discovered. To the south, expeditions by Juan Ponce de Leon, Alvar Nunes Cabeza de Vaca, and Hernando de Soto would map Florida and the American Southeast, as Spain prepared to establish permanent colonies in the New World. Likewise, to the north, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River, while Giovanni da Verrazzano mapped much of the east coast for France. All along the coast, the Europeans encountered the numerous tribes of Native Americans. Early interactions ranged from welcoming to violent, as cultures from separate hemispheres met for the first time. As it had in the Caribbean and South America, first contact introduced these cultures to each other with the sharing of gifts and trading of information. Naturally, these meetings exposed Native Americans to European diseases and caused widespread illness and death. The first attempts to make permanent settlements in the New World began in the mid-16th century with varying degrees of success. Surviving in the New World was not an easy task, and establishing a permanent settlement proved to be exceptionally challenging. In 1585, the English attempted to establish a permanent colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is today North Carolina. The journey across the Atlantic was brutal and left the colonists with few supplies when they arrived. Making contact with the local Aquascogok, Pamala, and Sakonnet tribes, the colonists, many of whom were military personnel, became embroiled in an argument with the Aquascogok and burned their village to the ground. Meetings with the Sakon, it went considerably better, outfitting the colonists with enough food to survive a miserable winter. Smallpox and influenza epidemics ran through every native village who encountered the colonists. Communication broke down, and violence finally convinced the colonists to move on, abandoning the colony. Arriving in 1587, a year after the first attempt to settle Roanoke failed, colonists, largely made up of middle-class Londoners with no military experience, landed on Croatoan Island and began to establish a settlement some 40 miles south of the first failed settlement. The colony suffered great difficulty surviving. In 1588, a relief mission to the colony was looted by Spanish naval vessels operating off the coast, leaving its new location unknown to English authorities. That same year, Spanish vessels sailed near Croatoan Island and found that it appeared abandoned. The next relief mission to the colony finally arrived in 1590 and found smoke rising from both Croatoan Island and Roanoke Island. A landing party discovered both settlements abandoned and sacked. The only clues were the letters CRO carved into a tree and the word Croatoan carved into one of the posts of a palisade allegedly built by the settlers of the colony. Known one as the Lost Colony, the settlers of Roanoke were never discovered. The colony deemed lost by the English government. In 1564, a group of French Huguenot settlers attempted to start a colony in what would become St. Augustine, Florida, only to have the colony sacked and all of its male citizens killed by rival Spanish forces. The settlement established by the Spanish colonists at St. Augustine is considered the first permanent European settlement in North America. Uplifting music in 1607, the English attempted again to establish a permanent colony in the New World. Led by the London Company, the settlement aimed to establish a colony in Virginia and selected a marshy region on the James River, which they christened Jamestown. The colony did well initially, quickly constructing living and meeting space as well as a palisade fort. Relations with the local Powhatan tribes began with hostilities, but gradually cooled over time as the settlers and native peoples of the region learned to cohabitate. The Powhatan offered food and friendship to the colonists who took the opportunity to search the surrounding region for gold and other precious metals. Instead, they found that the swampy region that they had inhabited held no riches but disease. The people of Jamestown suffered from lack of coordination, disease, and the harshness of the environment around them, despite the aid of the Powhatan people. It was only when Captain John Smith took command of the colony and in near-dictatorial fashion reorganized their efforts to establish trade with the natives and plant crops of their own in and around the colony. Smith returned home to England not long after his term as leader of the colony, but he had established a path for the colonists to follow that allowed Jamestown to endure difficult years of famine and struggle. Jamestown survived, and by the mid-17th century was thriving as more settlements began to grow around her. Jamestown has the distinction of being the first English settlement to survive in the New World. In 1619, 12 years after the colony's founding, Jamestown became the site of yet another first when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. 20 to 30 enslaved Africans who had been captured by English privateers from a Spanish slave ship were brought to Point Comfort, Virginia. From there, a number were sold or traded to the settlement at Jamestown. Slavery had existed in the New World since the mid-16th century, but this moment marked the beginning of 2.5 centuries of slavery in what would become the United States. The English continued their colonial settlement in 1620 with the establishing of the Puritan colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Unlike the financially motivated London Company at Jamestown, the Puritan colonists at Plymouth, known as Pilgrims, had come to America in search of religious freedom. They voyaged across the Atlantic in the Mayflower, suffering months of terrible weather at sea. When they arrived in the New World, they first landed near what would become known as Provincetown. There, the colonists, concerned over their rights to the land and their legal right to establish a colony, drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, establishing their right to self-govern while still holding allegiance to the English crown. However, without finding a reasonable place to begin building their settlement, and after a brief but violent encounter with a local tribe, the Puritans found Provincetown unfit and sailed up the coast for better ground. At last, they decided on Plymouth Harbor, building upon an abandoned Patuxet settlement as a base for their new home. Settled between two hills on which the colonists built two forts, the colony at Plymouth initially struggled through difficult winter, living aboard the Mayflower and building their settlement by day. In March 1621, they made first contact with the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag chief Massasoit was hesitant to trust the Pilgrims. Also uncertain of the Puritans was Squanto, a Patuxet native who had been taken in by the Wampanoag. Squanto or Tisquantum spoke English and had spent time in Europe after he'd been kidnapped by an English explorer in 1614. He had returned to America with another explorer whose party was ambushed and massacred by Massasoit and his tribe. Working as an interpreter, Squanto helped the Puritans in the Wampanoag reach an agreement of non-aggression. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated what has become known as the First Thanksgiving, along with Chief Massasoit and several of his men. The celebration lasted for 3 days, and both parties procured and presented various dishes of local game. Like Jamestown, Plymouth was well run, and its early success was built upon by enterprising companies and individuals in England. More and more companies began crossing the Atlantic and established new settlements. Throughout the 17th century, the English began spreading as more colonies were formed and amalgamated with their fellow English neighbors. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, would absorb the Plymouth Colony and others as it grew in size. As these settlements became more established, trade opened with Europe and goods, money, and more colonists poured into the New World. Not to be outdone, other European powers attempted to create their own permanent settlements as they grabbed more and more of the coastal region for themselves. What started as small settlements along coastal waters soon became large swaths of territory, claimed in the name of kings and queens from far-off European nations. In 1614, the Dutch West India Company began to establish permanent settlements in the Northeast around what would one day become New York and New Jersey. Small settlements and fur-trading outposts on Governor's Island and along the Hudson and East Rivers marked what was called New Netherlands. In 1624, fearing military incursions from other European powers, they purchased the island of Manhattan from the Munsee Lenape tribe for $24 and constructed Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of the island. The settlement which grew within and alongside the fort was called New Amsterdam. The settlement utilized its unique environment to expand trade and use hydropower to enhance its growth. New Amsterdam was a city of trade and commerce in its earliest form, and always would be. It was a tempting target for the English who wanted control of the Hudson for themselves. In 1664, 4 English frigates sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and ordered the Dutch to surrender the city. They did so bloodlessly, although the event did spark the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In June 1665, New Amsterdam was reincorporated under English law and renamed New York City. Spain, whose early discovery of the New World gave them an advantage in colonizing South America, and the Caribbean began settling in what would become the American Southeast from their earliest settlement in St. Augustine. The Spanish traveled inward toward their territorial conquests in Mexico and upward toward Canada, carving a path through the center of the North American continent. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's North American empire would cover much of the deep south, midwest, and western portions of the continent. France, England's longtime rival and chief competitor in North America, set their sights for permanent settlement along the St. Lawrence River. Still hoping for an easy path to the Pacific, the settlements Tadoussac, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal followed the winding St. Lawrence further and further inland. France established firm control of the fur trade in the region, then began to extend its influence further down the Mississippi River. In the Gulf, the French established a settlement along the bank of the Mississippi called Nouvelle Orleans or New Orleans. New Orleans was established in 1718 and was the gateway to the Mississippi, a crown jewel in France's North American empire. Tense music as the 18th century began, the numerous settlements continued to grow as Europe carved up great swaths of North America for their own. These colonial territories were defined by various treaties and agreements between the colonizing nations, often ignoring the already existing native population and the complex relationships which already existed in North America. Many Native Americans fought back. Acting as opportunists, tribes worked with and against European settlers, often sparking conflict. Raids on settlements were not uncommon, and the colonists could not always rely on their far-flung colonial protectors if these actions required a serious defense. One of the largest and most violent of these was King Philip's War. In 1675, in the colony of New England, war broke out after a significant failure of diplomacy between the colonists and the Wampanoag tribe and their allies. Metacomet, son of Massasoit, who had aided the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony, had become the Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy and did not have the same tolerance for the settlers as his father had. Disagreements over livestock, intrusion on Wampanoag land, and the presence of colonial missionaries attempting to convert natives to Christianity was the last straw for Metacomet, who, unlike his father, saw only danger in the existence of these settlers on their land. An alliance of Algonquian tribes led by Metacomet struck at not only New England's far-flung countryside settlements, but the larger, more established towns as well. With no English soldiers stationed in the colonies, the New England militia mobilized to defend their homes. The militia targeted native villages knowing that it would enrage and damage the Indians' ability to wage war. Metacomet was killed in 1676, just a year into the war. His death spelled doom for the Wampanoag and their Narragansett allies. With no one guiding the conflict, things quickly turned in the favor of the New England militia, who all but destroyed the Wampanoag people and forced their allies out of the New England territory. It was the bloodiest conflict in North America to date. In the wake of King Philip's War, tension between the English colonists and their French and Dutch neighbors grew high. In the Northeast, 5 native tribes located north of the New England colony formed the Wabanaki Confederation after witnessing the demise of their southern Wampanoag neighbors in King Philip's War, increasing tensions with the English colonists. In 1689, just 2 years after King Philip's War had ended, the colonists were at war again, this time at the behest of their mother countries. Fighting broke out as the English-backed Iroquois tribes attacked French settlements and the French-backed Wabanaki attacked English ones. As French and English soldiers made their way to the New World, the colonists of New England and New France prepared to fight each other. Known as King William's War, the conflict dragged on for nearly a decade and saw French successes in the colony of New York and English successes in Acadia, later known as Nova Scotia, and along the St. Lawrence River. Neither side was able to take their main goal. For the French, Boston; for the English, Quebec, and the war concluded in 1697. But King William's War was only the beginning. It was the first of 4 major conflicts between France and England, which pitted their various native allies against one another, and peace was not kept for long. In 1701, King Charles Roman II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died with no direct heir and a confusing web of potential replacements bound by secret treaties and backroom agreements. English, Austrian, Prussian, and Dutch powers scrambled to stop the French from taking control of the Spanish throne. Known as the War of Spanish Succession or Queen Anne's War in North America, the conflict originated in Europe and did not take long for the fighting to come to the shores of North America. In the South, Spanish Florida and French colonists in Louisiana were engaged by English colonists from the province of Carolina. The fighting decimated the native populations of the region and helped secure English control of Georgia. In New England, the Wabanaki again sided with the French, and continuous raids on New English settlements plagued the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Concerted efforts made by the English military once again failed to capture Quebec City, but made considerable gains in Acadia. The fighting in North America had little effect on the war's ultimate outcome in Europe, but more than 13 years of continuous fighting wreaked havoc throughout North America, permanently damaging native and colonial communities alike. In the end, the French would give away vital territory to the English, including the Hudson River Valley, Acadia, and Newfoundland. These concessions did not include the various native tribes engaged on either side of the war and set the stage for future conflict. For nearly 3 decades, there was relative peace between the major European powers in North America. In this time, the colonies grew larger and more complex, forming their own colonial governments, and expanding a new and thriving North American economy of agriculture, textile production, and maritime trade. As the value of the North American colonies grew, it did alongside her South American and Caribbean neighbors. Valuable gold and silver had been found in South America, and the Caribbean produced commodities which were by now a necessity in Europe and North America, namely molasses and other sugar products. The production of these commodities, of course, was powered by the sweat of slave labor. By now, the American colonies were all engaged in what was known as the Triangle Trade. Slaves from Africa were brought to the Americas, where these slave ships would deposit African slaves for sale and take on cargo of sugar bound for New England. These ships would then sell the sugar and slaves and take on rum, tobacco, cotton, and other goods, and return to Africa to trade them for slaves. On and on it went, an ever more valuable and grotesque sale of human lives. Slavery was rampant in the Caribbean and South America, and grew rapidly in North American colonies as well. From the first years of North American colonization in the early 1600s to the mid-18th century, the number of slaves imported to the Americas had increased from roughly 300,000 from 1,600 to 1,625 to more than 2 million from 1,751 to 1,775. The increased value of the Americas led directly to the Third of the Indian Wars. Like Queen Anne's War before it, the conflict began well outside of North America. Distrustful of the Spanish control of the South American market, the British were displeased by the mercantile stranglehold Spain had over trade to South America and the Caribbean. Likewise, the Spanish were displeased with British encroachment in North America, on what they believed was their territory north of Florida. After the 1721 founding of the colony of Georgia, following Queen Anne's War, the Spanish were convinced that the British had designs on removing them from Florida. Spanish vessels began boarding British trading ships, searching for contraband. While this action was legal due to past treaties, the boardings resulted in increased tensions between the two powers. In 1731, the British brig Rebecca was stopped off the coast of Cuba and boarded for inspection of contraband cargo. On board, the Spanish officials found an illegal cargo of sugar. Rebecca's captain, a man named Robert Jenkins, alleged that during the search He had been tortured by the Spanish officials and had had his ear partially cut off. While the Royal Navy would admit that Jenkins was at fault for carrying illegal cargo, his story, told before the Houses of Parliament in England, struck a nerve. In 1739, the British found that, among other reasons, the Spanish were guilty of depredations upon British subjects and commenced war against the Spanish in the Americas, known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. The conflict saw little action on North American shores, with the bulk of the fighting occurring in South America and the Caribbean, as the British Navy attempted to capture and claim multiple Spanish forts and port towns. Fighting between the British colonists in the Carolinas and Georgia and the Spanish colonists in Florida came to little fruit for either side, and again, only appeared to do the worst harm to the local Indian tribes who fought on either side. In 1742, another war broke out in Europe, this time between Prussia and Austria over control of Silesia. Once again, a question of the right of succession brought all of Europe's great powers into war. The death of Emperor Charles VI of Austria had left a power vacuum in Central Europe, with Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Hanover, and Russia supporting Charles VI's daughter, Maria Theresa, as his heir, and France, Spain, Prussia, and Sweden supporting Charles Albert of Bavaria, who believed he had the right of inheritance. This war, known as King George's War in North America and the War of Austrian Succession in Europe, swallowed everything in its wake, including the War of Jenkins' Ear. As war raged in Europe, France and England once again turned their attention toward their North American territories. As before, the Wabanaki Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy allied themselves with the French and British, hoping to effect some great change for their rapidly shrinking continent. Fighting focused once again over control of Acadia and the St. Lawrence River. In 1745, the British colonists achieved the first substantial gain in the last 50 years of colonial warfare with the capture of Fortress Louisburg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Fighting stretched down into the colony of New York as well as New England. The war took an awful toll on the British colonists, particularly in the final years of fighting. When the war at last came to an end in 1748, the British colonists were forced to return Louisburg to the French, infuriating the colonists who had won it at an excessive cost of life. Once again, after years of violence, the borders were returned to their pre-war status, with nothing having been gained. Territorial disputes went unsettled, grudges continued, and the situation in the North American backcountry was still violent as English colonists, French colonists, and Native American tribes all vied for control of the wilderness. The undefined borders between British and French colonies had long been an issue between the two nations. Yet despite multiple conflicts, no formal agreement had been reached as far as definitively laying out who owned what. It was only a matter of time before war broke out again. Uplifting music in late 1753, the lieutenant governor of the Virginia colony, Robert Dinwiddie, ordered a young Virginia major named George Washington to remove French colonial troops from forts in the Ohio River Valley. The colony of Virginia claimed this territory as its own and felt that it was within their right to vacate the French from the forts, which still dotted the region from the last century of fighting. The expedition resulted in a French rejection of Virginia's demands. And Washington, who was promoted to lieutenant colonel upon his return, was once again sent into the Ohio River Valley to remove the French from their forts, by force if necessary. In April 1754, French troops learned from their native allies, the Mingos, that a small British fort had been built by colonial militia at the forts of the Ohio River. French troops marched to the fort and captured it. They built in its place a much later fortification, which they named Fort Duquesne. Meanwhile, further south in the valley, Colonel Washington and his small force of colonial militia and natives, allied to the English, came upon and engaged an encampment of unsuspecting French troops. The French were quickly overwhelmed, and later explained that they had been sent to intercept Washington peacefully, and to warn him of his apparent incursion in what they believed was French territory. To Washington's surprise, the leader of the native forces accompanying him, Tanagrisson, attacked and killed the wounded French commander, likely due to a long-standing hatred of the French. Washington feared the French would attack and constructed a small fort, which he named Fort Necessity. Necessity was, as Washington predicted, quickly surrounded by French troops from Duquesne and forced to surrender. This small skirmish set the world on fire. Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie called for aid from his fellow colonies and from the British government back in England. Fearing that the incursion would strengthen French claims to the region, the British government immediately sent troops to strike at the various French forts still in and around the St. Lawrence River and the Ohio River Valley. The French sent additional forces to North America to hold off the inevitable British invasion. Quite suddenly, France and England were once again at war. Multiple early British forays into the Ohio River Valley and Canada failed spectacularly. Early into the war, it seemed as though the French would be able to secure their holdings in North America, and even found success in capturing a number of critical British forts in the colony of New York, including Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry. In 1758, fortunes changed for the English as the complicated system of entangled alliances produced by the past century of war finally ignited the 7 Years' War. The fighting in the Ohio River Valley, known as the French and Indian War in America, had launched the largest European land war to date, with every major European power of the era engaged. Millions of soldiers and thousands of naval vessels were activated for duty. Fighting stretched not only across North America but to Europe, the Caribbean, India, and Asia. As the French were forced to direct their attention to Europe and to other more valuable parts of their empire, the British were able to take advantage on the North American front, with the British Navy actively keeping the French from not being able to resupply along the St. Lawrence River. British and American colonial forces successfully captured Fort Niagara, Fortress Louisbourg, and the city of Quebec. As the French lost more and more ground, it became clear that the fight for North America was over. In 1760, British General Geoffrey Amherst managed to secure a formal surrender from the governor of New France, Pierre-François de Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil, Cavagnol, and largely ended the hostilities in North America. Meanwhile, the 7 Years' War continued abroad and continued to carve pieces from the Kingdom of France and her allies. In 1763, the 7 Years' War officially came to an end, and the French and Indian War with it. Casualties were astronomical for the period, with some estimates reaching as high as 1.4 million. Of that number, the French and Indian War accounted for roughly 23,000 killed, wounded, or captured, just under 2% of the total casualties of the global conflict. For nearly a century, England had beaten back the French, Dutch, and Spanish empires, gradually cementing its claim to the New World. Over the course of the 18th century, the successes of the British Empire during these conflicts had created the ideal conditions for their colonies in North America to experience an incredible population boom from roughly 250,000 in 1700 to more than 25 million in 1750. The raw materials produced by the American colonies, including hemp, copper, and tar, were necessary for the British Army and Navy to wage war and protect the vastly growing empire. While it was in the interest of the British Empire to defeat the French and secure their North American holdings, it had also been in the colonists' interests. The English colonists had no great love for the French, and anti-Catholic sentiment was a regular part of colonial life, especially in places like New England, which had been staunchly Protestant for the first 2 centuries of its settlement. That the American colonies were made up chiefly of individuals of the Protestant faith was naturally no coincidence. Many Protestant organizations had funded the various colonization efforts through the 17th century, and had maintained a lasting impact and presence into the 1700. However, the strongest impact of Protestantism in the American colonies came during the colonial wars, which dominated the early and mid-18th century. A global religious phenomenon occurred, known as the Great Awakening, gripped both Europe and North America and brought the Protestant faith to new heights. Suspenseful music, the Great Awakening was a major evangelical revival which expanded the Protestant faith throughout Europe and colonial North America. The revival brought about new religious theories and dogma, as concepts such as the nature of salvation and the idea of rebirth were spread by itinerant preachers who traveled the countryside giving sermons and lectures as they saw fit. These preachers were tremendous orators and captured captive audiences wherever they went. George Whitefield, a major player in this evangelical movement, traveled across the colonies and preached in major cities and small towns wherever he could gather a crowd. And gather them he did. In October 1740, while preaching in Boston, Massachusetts, Whitefield allegedly drew a crowd of more than 30 people from around New England. To put that in perspective, Boston was the highest populated city in colonial North America in 1740, coming in at roughly 17,000 people living in and around the city. Nearly double the city's population was present to hear Whitefield speak. The movement revived the religious spirit of Christian peoples and reaffirmed their faith through periods of intense conflict and uncertain survival. While the revival did not change governments or raise great armies as religious revivals had done in the past in Europe, the Great Awakening was formative for many individuals in colonial North America, many of whom would go on to be the founding fathers and mothers of the nation. Uplifting music, the 1763 Treaty of Paris saw enormous territorial gains for Great Britain. Vast swaths of formerly French-occupied land were now British colonies, including Canada, all of the Louisiana Territory east of the Mississippi, and many Caribbean islands. The British colonists in North America were ecstatic, as the land of the West would soon be open for settlement and development. The land, however, was already occupied, namely by the many Iroquois and other native tribes who had fought alongside the British during the war. To avoid any incidents, King George Roman III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade any settlement west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Proclamation Line. Effectively, the British had created an Indian reserve to the west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi. This did not sit well with American colonists who felt that they had fought the French and Indian War to gain access to this land. Naturally, many ignored the proclamation and settled west, increasing tension between themselves and the natives, much to the dismay of British colonial authorities. Relations between the British government and the American colonists became increasingly strained through the 1760s. As Great Britain attempted to regain control of their economy, the 7 Years' War had grown from a territorial dispute into a full-fledged global conflict with a cost to go with it. To pay off the war debt, the British Parliament levied a series of acts and taxes against the colonies in order to try and regain their lost financial footing. The colonists, who viewed themselves as loyal subjects to the British Crown, became increasingly agitated. It was not that the taxes were exorbitantly high. In fact, they were quite low, and often the measures taken by the British government were taken to lower the cost of British goods and raise the costs of those being sold by their French or Dutch competitors. For the colonists, the heart of the issue was not the cost, but rather the lack of consultation before levying the acts and taxes. As British subjects, the colonists believed they had all of the rights and liberties of any British citizen, which included representation. The British government argued that the colonists were represented virtually and that the Parliament acted in their best interests. Many Americans did not agree, and resentment began to grow. The rallying cry became, "No taxation without representation," as more and more colonists began to view King George Roman three as a tyrant and the British Parliament as an aggressor toward them. Great Britain had always regulated the economies of its respective colonies through acts and laws passed by Parliament. Through the last century, these laws had only been loosely enforced as the economic gains of the American colonies also benefit Great Britain. As the 1760s began, however, Britain needed to regain control of the financial situation, sparking animosity from the colonists who had long appreciated their free economic relationship and raising questions on the constitutional rights of the American colonists. In 1764, the Sugar Act was imposed to regulate the amount of French and Dutch sugar and molasses being imported to the colonies in favor of sugar and molasses being sold by the British East India Company. While it lowered the cost of sugar from the East India Company, colonists saw the act as a violation of their rights to trade and conduct business. Colonists protested the Sugar Act by boycotting British goods affected by the act. While this form of protest was not widely successful from an economic standpoint, the East India Company had one of its best years in 1774. The protest was noted by British Parliament, and many Whigs within the British government warned that relations could worsen if some sort of agreement could not be met. The following year, in 1765, the Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first act of Parliament ever directed specifically at the colonies as opposed to across the empire. The Stamp Act would require any form of official paper to need an official stamp. The act affected newspapers, almanacs, and official documents such as licenses, deeds, and wills. It even meant that playing cards required the official stamp. Such a direct tax had never been levied against the colonists, and many saw it as an attack by the Parliament in response to the boycotts the year before. Secret organizations known as the Sons of Liberty began to appear throughout the colonies and threatened violence on anyone who sold the stamps. Indeed, violence began to break out across the region as the Sons of Liberty targeted British officials who enforced the act. In one such case, the home of Lieutenant Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson was ransacked by an angry mob led by the Sons of Liberty. While Hutchinson and his family escaped the violence, their home was destroyed. Some colonists, however, did not act out in violence, but relied instead on a united political action. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City and compiled a Declaration of Rights and Grievances for the British Parliament. The declaration stated the position of many of the American colonists, stating that the British taxes levied without representation violated their rights as not only British subjects, but as men. Again, the Americans engaged in protest by boycott. This time with significant results. The income from imports to the American colonies fell from 250 pounds in 1764 to 944 in 1765. In England, American statesman Benjamin Franklin argued the case of the American colonies to Parliament and warned that continued abuse of the colonists could and would result in rebellion. Fortunately for the colonies, the Parliament experienced a shift in government, which had sympathy for Whig politics, which resulted in the repeal of the Stamp Act. The Parliament passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, reversing the Stamp Act, but at the same time insisting that the Parliament, as a legislative body, had the right and power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Both sides viewed the result as a political victory, believing that their interpretation of the rights of the colonists had been heard and secured. The Parliament believed it had exerted its will as the governing body of the colonies and once and for all had established their right to levy laws on them, and the Americans believed that the British Parliament would not ever directly tax them again without some form of representation. A door had been left open, and if the British government was not careful, it might be able to close again. In 1767, things were still not going well economically for the British. The Rockingham government, which had helped repeal the Stamp Act, was suffering at the hands of their Tory opponents, who criticized them harshly and felt that they had been played by the American colonists. Charles Townshend, who served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the ministry of William Pitt the Elder, found himself in control of the administration when Pitt suddenly passed away in 1766. Townshend himself died a year later, but before he did, urged by the financial crisis and the insistence of the Tory factions within Parliament, passed a series of 5 acts which would collectively bear his name, the Townshend Acts. The first act, known as the Revenue Act, imposed direct taxation on lead, glass, paper, paint, and notably tea. The second created a new customs board for the North American colonies in Boston and allowed customs officials unprecedented control over vessels coming in and out of colonial ports. The third suspended the New York Assembly from conducting business until it had complied with the requirements of the Quartering Act, passed in 1765, alongside the Stamp Act. The fourth act, known as the Indemnity Act, colloquially known as the Tea Act, lowered the commercial duties on tea imported by the East India Company, hoping to combat the smuggling of Dutch East India tea into English ports. The final act, known as the Colonial Trade Act, passed after Townshend's death in 1767, also aimed to target smuggling and granted Admiralty courts jurisdiction over all matters concerning customs violations, taking away the authority of local colonial courts. Before his death, Townshend feared that it would provoke a rebellious response from the American colonists. Townshend could not have been more correct. A flurry of activity gripped the American colonies. Pamphlets and letters flew from the pens of lawyers and farmers alike as they published their grievances in papers and broadsides across the colonies. Committees of correspondence were formed and shared ideas and debated the political and economic situation in the colonies. Once again, the Sons of Liberty were active, implementing the boycott of British goods and inciting riots where the opportunity was ripe. Particularly in Boston, unrest began to foment in such a way that the customs officials were obliged to leave town. This prompted British authorities to send for British troops to occupy Boston to quell the mob. On March 5, 1770, the consequences became quite clear when a young British sentry guarding the Boston Customs House was set upon by an angry mob of colonists. Accounts of the event state that the incident began as an argument between the private and a young wig maker's apprentice, who upon insulting the private and his officer was warned away from the post. Refusing to go and further insulting the officer, he was struck in the head by the private's musket. A crowd began to gather as the altercation grew louder and bells rang out indicating a fire, drawing yet more Bostonians toward the lone sentry. The sentry sent a runner to get help as the crowd became more violent, throwing ice and oyster shells at the sentry and calling for him to fire his weapon. Captain Thomas Preston and a handful of men from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment, afoot, arrived at the scene and deployed around the sentry with bayonets fixed. The crowd, now grown to 300 or 400 by some estimates, pressed in around the British troops, still throwing objects and shouting for them to fire. Preston shouted for the crowd to disperse and ordered his men to load their muskets. As the crowd pressed in on Preston and his men, they shouted, "Fire, damn you, fire!" A young private was struck in the head by a flying object, causing him to drop his musket. He bent to retrieve it and stood up and unintentionally fired into the crowd without orders. In a panic, the rest of the soldiers fired into the crowd in a ragged volley. As the crowd broke in horror and the smoke cleared, it revealed 3 dead colonists, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. A mixed-race former slave, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr were wounded and would die shortly after. 5 colonists had been killed in what would be known as the Boston Massacre. The city was put on high alert and British troops mustered in full force, preparing to defend against further riots. The trial which followed was a media circus, as the Sons of Liberty latched onto those who had died as patriots and martyrs. Attorney John Adams defended the British soldiers, despite his own personal feelings toward the British abuse of the American colonies and his relationship to his cousin, Samuel Adams, who was one of the founding members of the Sons of Liberty. Adams, whose devout loyalty to the law led him to believe that all men were entitled to a trial, no matter who they were or what they had done, successfully argued the men were not guilty of murder, and had 6 of these soldiers acquitted, and 2 others found guilty only of manslaughter. Adams' experience in the aftermath of the trial did little to move him closer to his cousin's patriot leanings, but did affirm his belief in the legitimacy of a government of laws. Tensions remained high in Boston, but gradually began to recede elsewhere. In 1773, amidst one of the worst banking crises of the 18th century, the British Parliament again made an attempt to ensure the survival of the British East India Company by undercutting the illegal importation of Dutch tea to the American colonies, while lowering the cost of iced tea to the lowest possible amount. Known as the Tea Act of 1773, the act allowed the AIC to unload its cargo in the American colonies without paying any duties on it, while charging an exorbitant amount on Dutch tea. The act prompted the Sons of Liberty to organize a raid on 3 merchant ships docked in Boston Harbor, carrying loads of East India Company tea, which had yet to be offloaded. Known as the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty boarded the ships and dumped 342 crates of tea into the harbor. The loss of tea amounted to approximately 659 pounds in 1773, the equivalent of $7 million today. Parliament was outraged and responded by passing a series of acts known as the Intolerable Acts in 1774. The first 3 acts, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Administration of Justice Act, all targeted Massachusetts alone and punished the city of Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony for its role in the Tea Party. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. The act angered citizens in Boston who had not even participated in the Tea Party, and they felt they were being punished unjustly without being able to testify in their own defense. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked Massachusetts' charter and brought the colony under direct British control. Town meetings were limited, and all appointments had to be appointed by the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor of Massachusetts to order the trial or retrial of any royal official to take place in Great Britain if the accused could not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. The final act, which affected all of the colonies, was the Quartering Act of 1774, which allowed royal governors to house soldiers in buildings if suitable quarters were not provided by the colonies. These acts were the last straw for many colonists. The perceived violation of what they viewed as their natural and constitutional rights as British subjects threatened to turn resentment of their British mother country to hatred and send the colonists into rebellion. Parliament hoped that the Intolerable Acts would isolate the problem which seemed to be the strongest in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the colonists began taking steps beyond simple committees of correspondence. The formation of the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774 worked to redress the Intolerable Acts and petitioned the British government for a repeal, as they had in 1765 with the Stamp Act. The petition to the king never received a formal reply. With no reply from the British government, in May 1775, the colonies convened again. The Second Continental Congress found itself again attempting to organize a general boycott of British goods and achieve some kind of formal response from the Parliament when the tension which had gripped the American colonies since the end of the French and Indian War finally reached a breaking point in a small village outside of Boston on a mild mid-April morning in 1775. Suspenseful music on the evening of April 18th. 1775, with tensions running high between the people of Boston and the British troops garrisoned in and around the city. the Sons of Liberty discovered that General Thomas Gage planned to march British troops to a cache of weapons and powder hidden in Concord just a few miles from Boston and destroy the supply. Patriots Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the Boston countryside and warned the population that the regulars are turning out, or as it's more popularly remembered, the British are coming. Colonial militiamen rose from their slumber, gathered their muskets, and rushed to stop the British troops from making it to Concord. On the morning of April 19th, 1775, Massachusetts militiamen faced off against British regulars on the Lexington town green. When ordered to lay down their arms and return to their homes, the militia refused and stood their ground. Captain John Parker, commanding the group of 70 or so Massachusetts militia, ordered them not to fire unless fired upon first. British officers ordered their men to level their muskets, but cautioned them not to fire. Suddenly, a shot rang out. No one knows where the shot came from. Neither side laid claim, both blaming the other. With this moment, known as the shot heard around the world, the resentment and anger boiled over at last, and the war began. When the American Revolution began, it did not start as a revolution. While certainly the ideas it generated were revolutionary, the actions of the First Continental Congress were those of a legislative body hoping to attain a form of reconciliation with the mother country. Better characterized as a rebellion, the earliest stages of the war were fought by the colonists to reclaim what they saw as their natural, born rights as British subjects and citizens. On the home front, early victories for the militias kept the spark of rebellion lit. However, it was not long before the British put a concerted effort into putting down the uprising. At the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, British troops stormed earthworks held by the colonial militia near Boston in a costly victory. It was becoming clear to many that if the colonies did not unify, they would be crushed one by one. While some representatives in the Continental Congress, now in its second session, still erred on the side of caution, believing that a reconciliation could still be made, the Congress made the decision to form a single unified army to prevent their forces from being wiped out piecemeal. At the head of this new Continental Army would be a colonel from the colony of Virginia named George Washington. Washington, born from one of the most prominent families in colonial Virginia, had had aspirations to be a naval officer in the English Navy when he was a young man. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was wary. She knew that a life at sea was a difficult one and could lead to an early death or maiming. She implored her son not to enlist in the Navy and to pursue a career in the Army instead. Washington obeyed and would spend much of his young adult life attempting to gain a commission in the British Army. He worked as a surveyor and endeared himself to the royal governor of Virginia, hoping to obtain that commission. It never came. Instead, Washington served as a colonel in the Virginia militia and implemented his own particular style of leadership, modeled after the British. Serving in this capacity, a young George Washington found himself at the center of some of the most important moments of the French and Indian War. At Fort Necessity and the Battle of Monongahela, Washington served alongside British soldiers as a colonial officer, and despite surviving numerous close calls with death and leading his troops valiantly, he was never made an official offer for a commission in the British Army. More than a decade after the end of the French and Indian War, Washington was serving as a representative of Virginia at the Second Continental Congress. When it came time for the Congress to decide who would lead this new united army, Washington was a natural choice. While his track record on the battlefield was less than stellar, his experience was unquestioned, and the fact that he was a Virginian pleased many of the Southern delegates of the Congress, as the war thus far had been fought by, and almost entirely took place in the northern colonies. In June 1775, after receiving a unanimous vote of approval from the Congress, Washington rode north for Boston and began to construct the necessary administration for the new Continental Army. The Continental Army struggled with many issues. Supply was always a chief concern. Lack of food and a reliable supply chain meant that the army needed to constantly forage for sustenance. This meant a tense and sometimes violent relationship with the civilian populations near where the armies had camped. Command differences plagued the army as well. Beyond disgruntled and entitled officers, this army consisted of troops from nearly every once colony on the East Coast. These soldiers were as different from each other as if they had come from another country. In one early instance, General Washington literally had to pull soldiers off of each other during a snowball fight outside of Boston, which had turned into an outright brawl between soldiers from Massachusetts and Virginia. Uniting these men into a fighting force was a war unto itself, uplifting music through the winter of 1775-76. The Continental Army diverted its efforts in two directions. To the north, the Congress ordered an invasion of Quebec under the command of Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, hoping to rally the Canadians to form a 14th colony and rise against the British as well. It did not go as planned, and while successes were made in upstate New York, the invasion ultimately ended in a dismal failure. Montgomery was killed, and the majority of Continental force was either captured or succumbed to smallpox. Meanwhile, Washington stayed with the army around Boston and managed the siege. With 11,000 British troops trapped in the city, Washington hoped the winter would force them to surrender, but he lacked the artillery to mount a full-scale siege. He sent the young Colonel Henry Knox to acquire artillery from the recently captured Fort Ticonderoga, and in March 1776, Knox returned to Boston, having successfully gotten the guns over the Berkshire Mountains through the winter. With Knox's guns looking down from Dorchester Heights, the British decided to evacuate the city. On March 17, 1776, the Continental Army reoccupied Boston, much to the joy of the civilian population. In the spring of 1776, the war was beginning to spread to other parts of the 13 colonies. Fighting had broken out in the Carolinas, and a British siege of Charleston was thwarted by a daring defense of Sullivan's Island. In upstate New York, the survivors of the Canada expedition fought to hold onto the gains they had made at Fort Ticonderoga and other key locations on Lake Champlain. Washington's forces in Boston moved south to occupy New York City. The Continental Congress ordered Washington to defend the island city. Despite the lack of a meaningful navy, Washington was uncertain his army, many of whom were untrained and undisciplined militia, was going to be capable of standing up to a British assault on the city. In Philadelphia, now the American capital, the Second Continental Congress had shifted from a government body imploring the British government for a redress of grievances to a government body responsible for the management of a war. The Olive Branch petition sent to England in July 1775 had been the last attempt of the Congress to make peace with the mother country. It had been met with the naming of the Congress as traitors and the Revolution as illegal. After the action in Boston, it had become clear to a faction of the Congress, led by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others, that a return to the pre-war status the American colonies in Great Britain had shared was no longer a possibility. The necessity for self-rule had surpassed any possible reconciliation with England. Many of the representatives also realized that victory in this conflict could only be achieved with the assistance of a foreign power, namely France. They knew France would not intervene on behalf of rebel colonists, but they might for a sovereign nation. Consequently, by early summer 1776, the majority of the provincial congresses were prepared for a complete separation. On June 11th, the Congress formed a committee to draft a document stating the justification on their separation from Britain. The Declaration of Independence was written largely by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. It laid out in plain words the reason for the former colonies, now states, desire for separation, and affirmed the assertion that they had every right as men to make the separation. After considerable revisions to the original drafts, including the removal of a section condemning the British slave trade, the Declaration was adopted by Congress on July 2, 1776, and its final wording, formally ratified on July 4th, 1776. Its most prolific line read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The declaration changed the shape of the war from a rebellion to a full-fledged revolution. The new colonies began operating as separate and autonomous states bound loosely by their unified Congress. Washington had the declaration read to his soldiers in New York City, spirit soared. At last, the soldiers of the Continental Army felt they had something to band together for: independence. The British struck back in August 1776, launching a series of devastating attacks in and around New York City. As Washington had feared, his army was not prepared for the professional and well-disciplined British troops, and without a navy, he had no hope of defending the island of Manhattan. After 5 consecutive defeats, Washington was forced to abandon New York City to the British and began a prolonged and bloody retreat into New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in late November 1776. Lord William Howe, the commander of the British troops in North America, pursued Washington into New Jersey and established a series of garrisons which stretched from New York as far south as Mount Holly. Washington knew that if he did not act quickly, the war would be over. He devised a plan to cross the Delaware on December 25th, 1776, and attack an exposed garrison in Trenton, New Jersey, occupied by a brigade of German troops hired by the British, known as Hessians. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night through a blinding nor'easter and marched his tired and beleaguered army south to Trenton. The Hessians were surprised by the arrival of the Continental Army, as fighting and maneuvering troops through the winter was generally viewed as difficult and dangerous for 18th century armies. He achieved a swift victory, fighting through the streets of Trenton, and won his first battle as commander of the Continental Army. 9 days later, after a tactically brilliant running engagement on January 2nd, the Continental Army again achieved victory on the morning of January 3rd in Princeton, New Jersey. The 3 battles fought kept the Revolution alive in its darkest hour. In 1777, the British were desperate to regain control of the situation and launched 2 separate offensives. The British, led by Sir William Howe, captured the American capital of Philadelphia after defeating Washington at Brandywine and Germantown in the fall of 1777. While the loss of the capital was a blow to the morale of the Continental Army, the army had not fallen apart, as Howe had expected, and Washington took his forces to winter at Valley Forge, just a few miles west of Philadelphia. In upstate New York, British General John Burgoyne pushed his army south from Canada, capturing Fort Ticonderoga and hoping to sever New England from the rest of the United States in order to bring about a swift end to the war. Instead, Burgoyne faced off against Continental generals Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, fighting a series of battles near Saratoga, New York. Thanks to impressive leadership by Arnold and sound strategy by Gates, Burgoyne's army was defeated and ultimately forced to surrender in October 1777. It was the largest British army to ever surrender to an enemy force to date, nearly 7,000 men. The British surrender at Saratoga, paired with the twin victories of Trenton and Princeton from the previous winter campaign, convinced the French that this new country, these United States, did indeed have a chance of winning the war. Eager to get revenge after a century of losing to the British, the French declared a formal military alliance with the United States, declaring war on Great Britain and legitimizing the Declaration of Independence in one fell swoop. Great Britain was about to become embroiled in a global conflict again. Meanwhile, Washington spent the winter of 1777-78 training the Continental Army to fight the way European armies did. He was aided by the help from foreign officers like the Marquis de Lafayette of France and the Baron von Steuben from Prussia. Steuben in particular instilled a sense of pride in the soldiers and trained them well. In 1778, when word came of the formal alliance with France, the British abandoned Philadelphia and rushed back toward New York. Their new commander, Sir Henry Clinton, did not have a high opinion of the Continental Army, but did have a healthy respect for the French, and feared their presence would trap the English in Philadelphia. Washington pounced as the British withdrew through New Jersey. His newly trained fighting force struck Clinton at Monmouth, New Jersey on June 28, 1778, and fought the British to a standstill. While the Battle of Monmouth was a stalemate, Washington's forces had fought well and withstood the British in an open field engagement. The British withdrew back to New York and would not venture into New Jersey in a meaningful way again. In 1779, the British began to feel the pressure of a global conflict. Realizing that the war could not be won in the North, the British turned their attention to the South, hoping to find more loyalist support. British forces captured Savannah and Charleston in the fall of 1779 and soundly defeated General Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. Gates was removed from command, and one of Washington's trusted lieutenants, General Nathaniel Greene, was placed in command of the Southern Department. Greene knew that the local population was not nearly as loyalist as the British expected and relied on the local militias and partisans to harass and harry the British supply lines. In 1780 and 1781, Greene and his other field officers lured the British away from the coast and into the Carolina backcountry, where they were soundly defeated at the Battle of Kings Mountain and Cowpen. As the British were lured further away from the Carolinas and into Virginia, the Carolinas exploded into a civil war as patriots fought loyalists for control of the states. Greene moved back into the Carolinas to recapture the states, fighting the British in a series of engagements and forcing them back to the coastal cities where they started. In the summer of 1781, Greene's army was exhausted from the near constant fighting, as was the British army under the command of Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis knew he could not stay in the South any longer and marched his army north toward Yorktown, Virginia. In the north, the combined American and French forces marched south to intercept Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis found himself surrounded with his back to the sea and no hope for rescue. After a month-long siege, he was forced to surrender. The surrender at Yorktown was the last major military action of the American Revolution. Peace talks opened after the surrender and took nearly 2 full years to finalize. In the end, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States as a sovereign nation and was made independent and free from Great Britain. Uplifting music as the American Revolution raged on, the Continental Congress, having declared independence, found themselves not only with the necessity to conduct a war as a sovereign body, but to unite the now independent states in a loose confederation government. On November 15th, 1777, the Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, creating a weak central government which bound the states together only in times of great conflict, such as the ongoing Revolution. The Articles worked through the war as they granted the Congress the power to conduct the war as a united body and deal with foreign nations as such. After the war, however, it became apparent that the loose system of central government was not going to work. Under the Articles, the state governments